We have one further piece of written testimony. It's pretty extensive. It comes from Stephanie Sloman, who's a resident of Pascoag, Rhode Island. And Mr. Kowski, I think you dealt with Stephanie in getting this written testimony entered into the record. Perhaps you could summarize it for us as best you can. It's several pages long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Ms. Sloman has submitted some written testimony to the Commission on a number of areas, very detailed examination of the current Act as well as some of the existing proposals to modify it. And so I'm going to summarize Ms. Sloman's comments here across a number of different areas that she's outlined for us and hit on, I think, some of the more salient points and some of the very important things that she points out. So on the topic of the host community definition, I think we've heard this before about this idea of what is a host community. And Ms. Sloman makes some good recommendations here around helping us to define what a host community is and potentially adding something called a secondary host community. She proposes adding language that would include any town or city where there may be a negative impact of aquifers, wetlands, wildlife, human health, and/or operational truck traffic negative impacts. Or consider adding the concept of a secondary host community, which would mean any town or city in the state in which the process or operation of a proposed or existing major energy facility may negatively impact any wetlands, aquifers, human health, wildlife, including but not limited to the installation or use of an existing or new groundwater well, the existing surface water resources, and the increased truck traffic during operations of said facility. So some recommendations around increasing the host community definitions. She's also recommended that other towns in a certain radius be included when you consider the impacts of wind on the pollution. I think there were some comments around the distance that would travel. She's recommending that communities within a 10-mile radius or more be notified during this process and have the opportunity to be considered as interveners in the process. Those are the thoughts on the host community. On the topic of the membership and the makeup of the board, Ms. Sloman's recommending the board be increased to 10 members and that we consider adding 3 members of the public, including one person that's deemed and considered to be an environmental expert, also adding the director of the Department of Health, the director of the Office of Energy Resources, and the other member of the community being the city or town council president for the host community. On the topic of, which we referred earlier tonight, on the protection for the members of the board, Ms. Sloman recommends that language be added to provide protection against any and all governmental or political repercussions or consequences depending on how the members of the board vote. In other words, no state agency, EFSB member can be forced to resign or otherwise be fired by their bosses after an EFSB decision has been made. On the topic of biodiversity and environmental impacts, she's recommending that if the proposed facility physically encompass 8 acres or more of forested land with or without the presence of any wetlands, that a biodiversity study be required for each season, spring, summer, fall, winter, for at least 1 year. And if the proposed facility is physically located within what's considered a wildlife corridor, regardless of size, that 2 years of a 4-season biodiversity study be required. On the topic of public notice and communication, Ms. Sloman's recommending that the phrase "towns and cities affected by the construction" shall mean all towns and cities by which are adversely or negatively impacted by increased truck construction traffic, and also that the councils of the towns and cities affected by operational increased truck traffic be notified in writing by the EFSB. On the topic of timing of public hearings, Ms. Sloman makes some recommendations around, and we heard this, I think Mr. Lamoureux was alluding to this, the idea of not having enough information to speak to certain aspects of the project. Ms. Sloman makes some recommendations. The first hearing shall be held within 6 months of the date of the application, as docketed by the board, and any time that the proposed facility changes its application via supplements to the EFSB will conduct a separate public hearing in the host community to hear public comment regarding the change. This change can include, but is not limited to, the number of days firing on USLD diesel, the number of gallons of hazardous chemicals on the site, new knowledge of a hazardous chemical on the site, or a change in the process, including potentially water use and demand sources. On the topic of agency procedures and advisory opinions, Mrs. Sloman makes a number of recommendations, one of which is regarding the need for the facility and unacceptable environmental harm. She goes on to recommend defining that better and rewording it to say, construction of the proposed facility is necessary to meet the needs of the state for the energy type. She's recommending the removal of the word region from that particular sentence. And moving on to the unacceptable environmental harm, she's proposing to reword the sections around an environmental harm and socioeconomic fabric of the state to say the proposed facility will not cause unacceptable harm to the environment, and that should further be defined, and that the socioeconomic fabric of the state improvement should be separate section. And that there should be a price tag incorporated into the environmental value that will be negatively impacted. On the topic of access to premises, Ms. Sloman points out that there are times that the statute calls out being able to access the facility for inspection. She points out that reasonable notice is currently required. She recommends that that be removed. Therefore, if the facility is doing something wrong, it won't have reasonable notice to fix the violation before it is noticed, as well as increasing the fine. On the topic of violations, Ms. Sloman points out that there's currently language in there around presenting the facility with a cease and desist order if they're not in compliance. She recommends also adding for failure to comply with any provision be punishable by a fine of not more than $100,000 per day, and for failure to comply with the cease and desist order should be punishable with a fine of $1 million per day. Looking to put some enforcement behind the cease and desist orders as well as the violations. Ms. Sloman goes on in closing to add 13 other points for consideration, and I'm going to call out a couple of them. Item number 7, she recommends adding a Water Resources Board member as part of the membership of the EFSB. Item number 8, she also recommends considering adding an environmental nonprofit organization member to the EFSB membership. And then item number 9, she recommends that no energy facilities be allowed to be approved in a wildlife corridor or within 10 miles of a said wildlife corridor as designated by Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And then lastly, item number 13 of her 13 recommendations, all of which were outlined very well, says all proposed energy facility applicants must provide an evacuation plan and zone with the EFSB prior to the first public hearing. And this evacuation plan and zone, whether or not the application believes it is necessary, must be available to the public prior to the first public hearing. And I believe from corresponding with members of the public on this issue, that's rooted in the fact that there's a current docket which does not have an evacuation plan, which is of concern to the community. Mr. Chairman, that's a summary of Ms. Sloman's comments, all of which are available.
Okay, thank you very much.